All right, get this. A truck driver gets convicted for a fatal accident. You think that's case closed, right? But then two separate courts decide his employer, the trucking company, is totally innocent. How in the world does that even happen? Today, we're going to unravel this really baffling legal mystery, the Mendoza family versus ES Trucking.
So let's set the scene. It's around noon, just a totally ordinary day. Catalina Mendoza had just popped into a lotto outlet and was walking down the road. As she starts to cross the street, a massive 14-wheeler truck just sideswipes her.
And this is just heartbreaking. It was actually Catalina's own sons who found her, trapped right under the truck's fuel tank. I mean, can you imagine? They rushed her to the hospital, but it was just too late. She was pronounced dead from cardiopulmonary arrest, all because of the accident.
Okay, so this is where the story takes a really strange turn. The driver, he was eventually convicted in criminal court. So you'd think that's it, story's over. But nope, not even close. When Catalina's family tried to get justice by filing a civil case against his company, ES Trucking, both the lower court and the Court of Appeals said the company was not responsible at all. So what's going on here? That's the mystery we're diving into.
Right, so let's talk about this confusing legal verdict, because you've got two courts telling two completely different stories.
So let's just lay it out nice and clear. On one hand, you have the criminal case against the driver. Verdict? Guilty. But then, on the other hand, you've got the civil case against his company, ES Trucking, and the verdict there? Not liable. I mean, how can the driver be guilty, but the company he works for is completely off the hook? It just doesn't add up.
And you know, the Court of Appeals actually tried to explain this away. They literally said it was, and I'm quoting here, a terrible accident which could only be blamed on being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Basically, they just called it bad luck and washed their hands of the whole thing. Their logic was, hey, we don't think the driver was negligent, so how can his company be responsible?
But for the Mendoza family, that was not justice, not by a long shot. So they didn't give up. They took their case all the way to the top, the Supreme Court. And that's when things started to change. The highest court in the land decided, okay, let's take a real look at this, and started asking the questions the other courts just didn't.
So the Supreme Court basically broke this whole mess down into three key questions. First, was the driver really negligent? Let's look at the accident again. Second, what kind of company was ES Trucking anyway? Like, what was their actual business? And third, and this is a big one, did the company do its job as an employer?
Okay, so for this next part to make sense, you got to understand a key legal term, common carrier. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. If your company moves stuff or people around for anyone who will pay you, you're a common carrier. And why does that matter? Because the law holds you to a much higher standard.
Now, ES Trucking's whole argument was, whoa, hold on, we're a private company. We just use our trucks for our own stuff. They tried to claim they weren't a common carrier at all, so those strict rules didn't apply to them. But as you're about to see, the evidence, well, it told a completely different story.
So how did this whole case finally unravel? Well, this is where the Supreme Court basically put on its detective hat and started following a trail of evidence that the other courts had somehow completely missed.
First up, let's go back to the driver. The lower courts kind of just shrugged and said, well, the truck was in its lane. But the Supreme Court looked closer and said, wait a minute, Catalina was already halfway across the road. Any careful, prudent driver would have seen her and stopped. This wasn't bad luck, it was a straight-up failure to be careful. Boom, negligence is back on the table.
And this, right here, is where the company's entire story just falls apart. Clue number one, the license plates. The truck itself had a green private plate, but the trailer it was hauling, a yellow plate for public hire. That's a huge red flag. Then, the manager admitted on the stand that the stuff in the trailer wasn't even theirs. They were hauling it for a customer. They even confessed they'd applied for a public carrier franchise, but never actually got it. So the Supreme Court laid down the law. It doesn't matter what your paperwork says. It matters what you do. And they were absolutely acting as a common carrier.
And if you need any more proof, here it is, straight from the horse's mouth, under oath. When asked if the truck had the proper franchise from the government to operate for hire, the company's own manager just said, there was none. Case closed on that front. So that brings us to the final, critical piece of this puzzle. It's a legal idea called vicarious liability. All it really means is that a company is responsible for what its employees do, unless they can prove they did everything a responsible employer should do. The law calls it the diligence of a good father of a family. Basically, did you do your homework on your employees?
So the big question is, did ES Trucking meet that standard? Were they a good father of a family? Well, let's take a look at their hiring process. They got an application and a license. They made one phone call to check a reference, and that's it. No police clearance, no NBI clearance, no check for the required government skills certifications, no safety training seminars. This wasn't diligence. This was a complete joke.
And here it is, the final nail in the coffin, again, from their own manager. When asked why they didn't check for an NBI clearance, he just said, "We did not because it's not the policy of the company. We don't require it." I mean, he just admitted it right there. It was company policy to be negligent. That is a total failure of their duty to hire and supervise people properly.
But wait, it gets even worse. It turns out this whole thing was just a pattern of negligence. Not only was the truck not properly registered for hire, but they hired a driver who didn't even have the legally required government certification to drive heavy trucks. And then, and this is just wild, after the accident, they actually altered the truck's body number. They changed it from a 5 to a 15, trying to hide the truck from the investigation. That's not just negligence, that's a cover-up.
So with all of this laid bare, the negligence, the cover-up, the lies, the Supreme Court had everything it needed to finally bring accountability and justice.
And that's exactly what they did. The Supreme Court completely reversed the lower courts. They found ES Trucking liable for the death of Catalina Mendoza. Finally, after such a long, painful fight, her family got some measure of justice.
And it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. The company was ordered to pay for everything. Actual damages, like funeral costs, but also civil indemnity and moral damages for the family suffering. And, importantly, they had to pay exemplary damages. That's basically the court's way of punishing the company for being so incredibly reckless and sending a clear message. This kind of behavior is not okay.
You know, this case really hammers home a super important legal principle. A company can't just throw its hands up and say, "Not my problem," when an employee messes up. They have a real proactive duty to prove that they did their homework, that they acted like that good father of a family to prevent this kind of damage from ever happening.
And that really leaves us with one final big question. That phrase, the diligence of a good father of a family, it's not just some dusty old line from a law book. The tragic story of Catalina Mendoza makes it real. It forces us to ask, what does that duty of care actually mean for companies right now, today, in our world filled with risks everywhere? That's a question every single business out there really needs to think about.